For 2 years, fish kept disappearing from a managed aquarium tank, and nobody could explain it. Not stolen, not sick, just gone, and whatever was taking them had been living inside that tank the entire time, hiding beneath the sand, completely invisible, right in front of the staff who fed those fish every single day. Visual. Extreme close-up of bobbit worm jaws, 5 serrated mandibles open wide, underwater shot. What they eventually found, after dismantling the entire exhibit, was a worm, not the kind you find in garden soil, something far older, far larger, and built for one purpose only. Visual. Bobbit worm lunging from sand, strike captured in slow motion, fish caught in jaws. Its strike lasts less than a fraction of a second. Its jaws, 5 of them, serrated like hunting knives, snap shut with enough force to shear through fishbone. And in the moment of impact, it injects a chemical into its prey that partially paralyzes the nervous system, stopping the fish from escaping even if it survives the initial hit. Visual. Bobbit worm retracting back into sand burrow, dragging fish downward, top-down view. This is the bobbit worm. Eunice aphroditois. It has been doing exactly this on ocean floors around the world for an estimated 400 million years. Visual. Ancient fossil record diagram of polychaete worm, museum display, geological timeline graphic. And in all that time, it has barely changed. Because it does not need to. Visual. Tropical coral reef overview. Indo-Pacific waters, sunlight filtering through water column. The bobbit worm lives across the Indo-Pacific and parts of the Atlantic, buried inside the sandy substrate of coral reefs, seagrass beds, and shallow coastal floors. It spends almost its entire life underground. Visual. Cross-section diagram of ocean floor, worm tunnel illustrated beneath sand surface, depth markers. Its burrow can go down almost a meter into the sediment. The worm lines the tunnel walls with mucus to keep them from collapsing, essentially building itself a fortified hunting chamber with a single opening at the top. Visual. Bobbit worm tip protruding from sand, antenna-like sensory appendages visible, waiting still. That opening is the only part you ever see, if you see it at all. From that position, it waits. It has no eyes in the conventional sense. Instead, it uses 5 sensory appendages called antennae, arranged around its mouth, that detect vibration, movement, and chemical signals in the water above. Visual. Underwater night dive footage, dim torch beam, sandy reef floor, barely visible worm tip. It does not track prey. It does not chase. It simply waits for something to come close enough. And then it moves. Visual. Slow motion replay of bobbit worm strike, fish approaching sand, worm erupting upward. The strike is one of the fastest predatory movements in the ocean. High-speed camera footage shows the worm erupting from the substrate, jaws fully extended and retracting back underground, all within milliseconds. Verify. Exact strike duration from published high-speed camera studies. The fish's escape reflex, the sea start response, is already one of the fastest reactions in vertebrate biology. The bobbit worm is faster. Visual. Fish reflex diagram, sea start escape maneuver illustrated, timeline comparison graphic. In many recorded strikes, the fish is pulled below the sand before it completes a single full-body bend, which means it never escapes, not because it was too slow, but because the worm gave it no time at all. Visual. Blue Reef Aquarium, Newquay exterior, aquarium signage, tourist visitors entering. Now back to that aquarium. The incident that brought the bobbit worm to wider public attention happened at the Blue Reef Aquarium in Newquay, England. Verify. Correct aquarium name and location. Staff had built a new coral reef exhibit. They stocked it with fish. They monitored it. They maintained it. And slowly, quietly, fish began to disappear. Visual. Aquarium coral reef tank, colorful fish, some gaps in fish population, staff observing. At first, they assumed disease, then aggression between species. They checked water chemistry. They reviewed feeding schedules. Nothing explained it. The fish just kept vanishing. At night, mostly, when the exhibit lights were low. Visual. aquarium worker removing coral pieces from tank, careful dismantling of rock structures. Eventually, staff noticed something else. Pieces of coral were being damaged, not from the top, but from below. The substrate was shifting in places it should not have been shifting. They decided to take the exhibit apart entirely. Visual, aquarium staff using nets and tools, removing substrate layer by layer, buckets of sand being sieved. Layer by layer, they removed the sand and rock, and somewhere beneath all of it, deeper than they expected anything to be, they found the worm. Over a meter long, healthy, well-fed, and apparently entirely unbothered by the 2-year disappearing act it had been running inside a managed exhibit, behind glass in front of hundreds of visitors a day. Visual, large bobbit worm being carefully extracted, placed in containment vessel, full body length shown. It had been there since before the exhibit opened, almost certainly introduced as a juvenile, invisible in a piece of live rock imported for the display. It had grown, it had built its burrow, and it had hunted, systematically, every time the lights went out. Visual, bobbit worm full body underwater, extended length against reef background, dorsal iridescent sheen. Here is the thing about bobbit worm size that most people find genuinely difficult to process. The largest confirmed specimens reach nearly 3 meters in length. Verify, maximum confirmed specimen length from peer-reviewed source. 3 meters. That is longer than a standard car. Most of that body is hidden underground at any given moment, compressed into a burrow system that the worm excavated itself. Visual, size comparison graphic, bobbit worm silhouette versus car versus human diver to scale. And they can live for over 25 years, possibly longer, which means a single worm in a single location can quietly dominate a patch of reef for decades. The fish living above that sand have no way of knowing it is there. There is no warning coloration, no territorial display, no sound. The worm produces almost zero detectable water movement until the moment it strikes, because it is not approaching from above. It is already there, directly beneath, every time a fish swims past. Visual. Bobbit worm jaws close up, 5 mandibles illustrated with labels, sclerite structure detail. Those 5 jaws are made of a material called sclerotized chitin, the same biological substance that forms insect exoskeletons, but hardened and mineralized specifically for cutting. They work as a spring-loaded trap, held open under tension, released by a neural trigger, snapping shut in a single coordinated motion that cannot be reversed mid-strike. Visual, mechanical trap, spring comparison, slow-motion jaw closure, footage, microscope image of jaw structure. There is also the matter of the toxin. The exact chemistry of what the bobbit worm injects is not fully characterized. It remains an active area of research. Verify. Current status of bobbit worm. Venom research. What is known is that prey animals struck by the worm frequently display symptoms consistent with acute neurotoxic exposure. Slowed movement, loss of coordination, and failure to complete escape responses even when physically capable of doing so. Visual. Fish struggling feebly after strike, slow, uncoordinated movement, being pulled down. In plain terms, the bite hits, the toxin hits, and by the time the fish's brain sends the signal to flee, the signal does not arrive cleanly. Visual. Marine biologist with underwater camera equipment, dive gear, reef survey setting. For a long time, the bobbit worm was considered a curiosity. Known to science, poorly studied, rarely filmed in its natural hunting behavior. That began to change when underwater camera technology improved enough to capture genuine night hunts on reef systems. What those cameras recorded shifted the scientific conversation considerably. Visual. Night dive footage, underwater torch beams, sand substrate in darkness, bobbit worm tip visible. Because it is not simply an ambush predator in the basic sense, a thing that sits and waits. The worm appears to make active adjustments based on incoming sensory data. It changes the angle of its exposed antennae. It alters the depth at which it positions its jaws relative to the sand surface. In some observations, it appears to respond differently to different sizes and types of prey, adjusting strike timing rather than using the same motion for every target. Verify. Published behavioral studies on prey-specific strike adjustment. Visual. Research footage comparison. Different prey types approaching worm, different strike responses illustrated. For an animal with no centralized brain in the way vertebrates have one, a creature whose nervous system is distributed through its segmented body, this level of apparent behavioral flexibility is remarkable. It raises a question that marine biologists still do not have a clean answer to: how much of what the bobbit worm does is hardwired reflex, and how much is something more? Visual. Reef ecosystem wide shot, diverse fish species, coral formations, healthy substrate. The bobbit worm is not a villain of the reef. In a functioning ecosystem, it plays a role, consuming smaller fish and invertebrates, contributing to the nutrient cycling that keeps substrate chemistry balanced. But in a disturbed ecosystem, or an aquarium, the calculus changes. Visual, damaged reef section, fish population thinned, substrate disrupted, aerial or wide underwater angle. There are documented cases of bobbit worms in areas where natural predators have been removed by overfishing, expanding their populations and significantly reducing local fish densities. Verify. Specific documented cases of reef impact from bobbit worm population increase. The worm is difficult to control once established. It retreats deeper into its burrow when threatened, can regenerate damaged body segments, and, given its potential lifespan, will simply outlast most short-term intervention attempts. Visual. Worm retreating rapidly into sand burrow. Sand disturbed around entrance, burrow sealed. The only reliable removal method, as the Newquay Aquarium demonstrated, is complete excavation of the substrate, which, on a wild reef, is not an option. Visual. Bobbit worm tip in final waiting position, antennae extended, sand still, ocean floor quiet. Here is what stays with you about the bobbit worm after you have read through all of it. It has been doing this for 400 million years, before the first shark, before the first bony fish, before the continents were arranged the way they are now. The ancestors of this worm were hunting from beneath the substrate of ancient sea floors when the oceans were populated by creatures nothing alive today would recognize. Visual, geological timeline animation, ancient ocean life, Cambrian period imagery, evolutionary lineage, and in all that time, the strategy has not changed in any meaningful way. Burrow. Wait, strike, drag down. Visual, modern coral reef, healthy and diverse, sunlit shallow water, fish shoals overhead. Because it works, completely, every time. The fish above the sand do not know what is below them. They cannot know. The worm has no interest in being seen or feared or understood. Visual, final slow zoom into sand surface, nothing visible, camera holds on still sand, then a single antenna tip appears. It is simply there, beneath every sandy reef floor, in warm shallow water across half the planet, waiting with a patience that evolution has had 400 million years to perfect. That is what the Newquay Aquarium staff found when they finally emptied the tank. Not a monster, not an anomaly, just an animal that is extraordinarily, ruthlessly good at exactly one thing, and has been since before our entire vertebrate lineage existed. Visual. Bobbit worm extracted full length, held carefully, final still frame of worm against black background. And somewhere beneath the reef you are imagining right now, there is almost certainly one waiting. If this kept you watching, hit subscribe. We cover the ocean's most extreme predators every week. And next time, we are going into the deep water where the pressure alone is enough to kill. To find the creature that somehow thrives there. 1. Atlantic range specifics for Eunice, aphroditois. 2. Exact strike duration from published high-speed camera studies. 3. Correct aquarium name and location, Blue Reef Aquarium Newquay. 4. Exact documented length of Newquay Aquarium specimen. 5. Maximum confirmed specimen length from peer-reviewed source. 6. Current status of bobbit worm, venom toxin research. 7. Published behavioral studies on prey-specific strike adjustment. 8. Specific documented cases of reef ecosystem impact from bobbit worm population expansion.